And I'm about to bring on a guest speaker, Dr. Umadat Maharaj. Let's welcome him to the JAMAAT-AL-MUSLIMEEN with a solid takbir, inshallah. Takbir.
All right, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. And I came in a little late, later than planned, to hear a few minutes of Brother Figuera. Always fiery and passionate about the rich political history of this country. But my line of story is a bit different. And I came this afternoon to speak about, or a little bit about, any time that I have, in terms of my perspective of the occasion of Indian arrival, agriculture, and what brought us to this point. And it could probably have some linkages, just as he described in his closing few remarks about land ownership and how there could be some dichotomy and divide in this modern society that we live in that is supposed to be all-inclusive, supposed to be multicultural, and embracing an equal opportunity for all of us. When Brother Ansar invited me to share some thoughts, it was a little while from now, but I wasn't around in Trinidad and still thinking about the topic. And over the times, we're in the year of our Lord 2024, and people would have spoken about their perspectives of Indian arrival every year for the last however many decades. And I think it is each speaker who contributes to the topic also in some way shape the narrative about what Indian arrival is. Because if we have somebody narrating or explaining their perspective of history or their understanding, it is less to us as the listener to not only digest what they are saying, but of course put that in perspective about what the occasion could mean for us. And of course, I'm seeing the nice displays outside where we try to teach a generation younger than us about, consciousness and giving them some kind of awareness and education about little pockets of Indian history, some of the spices, the foods, the wear, garments. I'm seeing some nice displays outside. And I even had a friend all the way from Barakpur. She operates a small food business in a farming district called Rural Delights. And she came up all the way here to Mokarapo to make the chulha someday last week, and we thank her for that act of kindness. But that says that we still have a rich living in this country. We still have a fabric that joins all of us together, regardless of where we come from, geographically or even historically in this conversation. But if we reflect on the struggles and the opportunities associated with Indian arrival in this country, and of course we would be referring to Indian arrival because that is the occasion, but it does not, diminish or extinguish the challenges and opportunities confronted by any other, body of people that make up the population who came here and contributed to our development over the years. But when we speak about Indian arrival, people tend to associate it a lot with the music, with the dance. We always bring back these portrayals of the Fatel Rozak, the boat, the tools and the implements that people used to use to feed themselves, to do farming, to do different forms of activity. But on top of all of that dance and fashion and so on, I think one of the real reasons that we could associate as well is actually food production and a better standard of living. If we look back at all these stories about indentureship and so on, they spoke about the estates here, and Brother Figuera spoke about the need for labor and the competitiveness of the price of labor in those years and so on, right? So really, that food production or agriculture and a better standard of living is really what I think attracted our foreparents to come here in those years, all right? Now, so strange because if we compare that today, right? Think about society today and think about that motivation, however many decades ago, we could say that survival, therefore, in my mind, survival is really the message of Indian arrival in this country. Because they came here looking for something better than what they were leaving behind, because they didn't come under a regime of slavery and, the different parts of history. But they also came here, as I was saying, for the purpose of agriculture, which is what I wanted to focus on in a few minutes um, that I have. But it's so interesting that if we begin by that thesis or that hypothesis, therefore modern society in 2024, I think actually drifted backwards over the years because people are now finding it more difficult to survive. All right, if we came here looking for survival and betterment, and people here today in 2024 are seeing trouble, families are falling apart, or youths seeing different challenges and so on. I mean, all of us live it on a daily basis. It means that modern society really drifted backwards in terms of some of the opportunities that we offer in agriculture and rural development. But in that drift, we have in fact, we could argue that we have in fact moved away from the land, we have moved away from the farmer, that demographic, and we have also lost some of the togetherness that these people banded together about in those days to travel across, some distance across the globe and to come here in person, all right, to appear in the West Indies and to, of course, carve a new future that we continue to live and hopefully enjoy, all right? So these are the basic thoughts to start my discussion, but it also lends itself to a lot of the discourse that we have among school children working with the National 4-H Council and other groups, that many people actually don't know where their food comes from, they don't know how it is produced, and neither do they respect the men, women, boys, and girls who work to feed us. Because we believe in fast food, we know about, the different supermarket foods and packaged and processed foods and so on that people go on all about. But really, if we think about rural development or the rural areas of this country, that always seems so distant. Every year, these people talk about the same challenges of flooding, dilapidated infrastructure, and, all these stories. But I want to speak about that flooding too in a few minutes, in the sense that those small parcels of land that Darius was referring to, those parcels that they had, if you think about it, a lot of the settlements were actually, in the early days, on marginal lands. In those days, if you think back, it really didn't have, let's say, prime real estate, like how we have Westmorelands and, Valsayn and here, there, and everywhere in 2024. But after these settlements, if you think back, they were really on lagoons, on riverside edges. These settlements and communities sort of shaped and developed over time into what they are, all right? But a little piece of history would tell us about a place called Mesopotamia. If any of you remember that, that's one of the few words I remember from high school in history. Talk about Mesopotamia. And that's a nice thing. I actually make a personal note here I want to share with you that for those of us who, of course, wouldn't know or remember, that Mesopotamia was a place or a region that is now in what we call Iraq, parts of Syria, Turkey, and Kuwait. It was a large region in that time. It came from the Greek word meso, meaning middle, and potamia or patamos refers to river. It was a land in the middle of two rivers, which is the Tigris and the Euphrates River, all right? And because of its location, because of its geography, it had a few things playing for it. In our documented history, if you read more on it, some parts of the literature describe this place as the cradle of civilization, all right? That's the language they use in history, the cradle of civilization. And how that came about is because it is a place that was founded, or it found prosperity through a combination of its geography, meaning where it was located, agricultural innovation, trade in those days, in our little West Indian history, we talk about bartering and so on. Trade in those days would have involved the exchange of, I imagine, grains and whatever produce and livestock and so on similarly. And it led to the development of a complex society because where it was located, people would cross, if you could imagine, the rivers from both sides and mix into that land. All right? Now, what's the point about all that? The main point is that the prosperity of Mesopotamia was really brought about in history by flooding. Because of the flooding of those rivers, it brought nutrient-rich soil, it had extended growing seasons, it also had with it predictability and planning, even in those years. And of course, abundance of agriculture led to production, storage, and this little trade that I was describing, and commerce in those years. All right? Now, if flooding was the basis for this in 3500 BC, this was a time thousands of years ago. All right? In 2024, what is the story of flooding in this little country? Flooding is not an opportunity to irrigate land or to bring any form of prosperity. Flooding is usually associated with what? Loss of assets, loss of land wealth, loss of food production, loss of your residential space, hardship, all of this. All right? So thousands of years ago, people knew how to plan and predict and use that for agriculture. And thousands of years ago, if we just, in this amateur way that I am doing it, trace history, all of that water wealth is going to waste and not managed. That's one point that we keep in mind. The other is, if we overcome some of these barriers that modern society has built around us in terms of race, religion, language, all of that, and we look at those people who genuinely came to build a society, to work together in agriculture and so on, and we think back about what kept that society together, it really comes from the same word, that social structure of the word agriculture. All right? The prefix is agri, A-G-R-I, but the bigger part of that word was a culture. All right? It was a culture practiced by the rural family. And that, of course, led to food production, sustainable living, preservation of the natural environment, flora, fauna, all the things that we want to see. But it was linked to some type of a social culture that I'm arguing or describing that we have moved away from a bit today. And in those years, those early years, when we talk about extension services now and we rely on the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, to assist farmers and whoever else interested in food production, in those years, those people were actually our neighbors. They were the farmers next door and people in the village who would save seeds, who would have better breeding livestock, who would exchange things. And it wasn't a matter of a selfish living, I think, of competing, although human nature is like that. But it was not a general story of competing, but rather to ensure that everybody could maximize their profit, had a good living, teach responsibility, and of course, as I was saying, bring that community together, that culture. So today we have a breadfruit trees initiative, for example, I am a part of, where we share plants or planting material to schools, places of worship, and other public spaces around this country. I think so far, the guy who organized it, Raul, who I work with, he probably shared about 9,000 plus trees around this country. And the idea is, of course, one man can eat all the fruits from a breadfruit tree, but the people directly around that in its immediate community and surroundings could have something to eat. All right, Ansar, for example, had a grapes garden in the back of the Jamaat. I'm sure he shares material, the passion fruit, all of that. The lady who built the little chulha outside, she shared from her skill. And like all of you, any form of arms is the same culture that we try to keep revolving, that living that I'm describing. So, during and beyond that indentureship period and up to now, we could say, in some ways, the culture component of agriculture has sort of dissipated in this society. But nonetheless, the opportunity is there for us Just like how we could acknowledge that we no longer have donkeys on farms, people don't have landline phones in their house, we don't write handwritten letters to our friends anymore. You know, a lot about life has changed. So it doesn't mean that the living that probably existed in those years that we are describing is sufficient for today. I'm not saying that. But again, it is that culture that remains with mankind, that social structure that I think we want to remember. So, in the last few bits, the last few thoughts, is really where have we come now? Because if at every Indian arrival we try to reflect on, these groups or these hundreds of people coming here to work on the rice and sugar estates and so on, that's the usual conversation anyway you go around the country this weekend. Also, but if I could just leave with you some few things to think about. One is when Caroni Limited closed, we had a rice sector, rice production sector at that time. And when that closed around 2003, 2004, the information I have here is that rice imported into this country immediately doubled to 18 million US dollars the year after, all right? Now, why is that important? Since then to now, when we have closed this part of agriculture, we have in fact imported over 2.4 billion TT dollars in rice to feed this population. All right? Now that's alarming because nearly everybody has rice in some form as part of the daily diet. The other part about that is sugar. We talk about these major sugar estates and so on. And since then to now, we have in fact imported over $4.2 billion in sugar, confectionery, and related products from various parts all over the world to service our population here, perhaps for food manufacturing and re-export. All right? So it is very naive of us to think that we did not have a future in these crops, in these commodities, and the thousands of people who earned a living around these commodities. It is disingenuous for us to continue believing that these parts of our history, our agricultural history, were not feasible. All right? So today, in closing, and thanks for the opportunity to be here, we could say that Guyana is on the upswing, right? There's a lot of talk in the region, in Eastern Caribbean and CARICOM about Guyana, oil and, the oil sector boom and all of that. But, years gone by, we traditionally associate Guyana with rich agriculture, a land of many waters, and we could speak a lot about their agriculture. But the point is, while that is happening, that's their Demerara gold. What it is people are speaking about Trinidad and Tobago on this occasion. When you go outside and you look back home, what it is people see, and my concern is what they continue to say, because, what you put into the atmosphere is very hard to take back. So in closing, just one simple call I think that we should make for ourselves and our own children is that we really need to go back to these basic tenets of production, processing, and consumption. And of course, that food sovereignty, it comes naturally, or eventually I think people will demand that by way of public policy in this country, where you must represent local or support the development of a locally driven subsector. So these things don't just happen by me thinking it through, but of course it requires new leadership, I think, of a new culture and a new people wanting better for themselves and not accepting what someone tells you should be better or should be your own future. That is human spirit, or the spirit that God gave us to define our paths. So, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, that reverence to food in your homes, the gardens and farms, and even the forestry products in this country, I think it affords us some form of reverence to the men, women, boys, and girls who work to feed us, and therefore every meal we should appreciate, and we should therefore, in closing, use this occasion, as I said, to commit to that meekness, that self-sufficiency, and a return to the land. May God bless us all. Thank you.
I think we could give him a better takbir than that, huh? I know it's after lunch and the belly started grinding a little bit, but let's give Dr. Omadat Maharaj, sorry. A hearty takbir. Takbir! Yeah.